Welcome to episode 2 of Chainwheel Diaries, the podcast about bike travel told by the travelers themselves. I'm your host, Brian Berlin. Today's guest is Larry Loewy, a Long Island native and regular bike traveler. I met Larry on a bike tour of Death Valley, and he graciously agreed to appear on Chainwheel Diaries. In this episode, listeners will learn how Larry took up bike touring and will be inspired by his adventures.
So, Larry, welcome to the podcast. It's wonderful to have you here. Larry and I met over a year ago, on an adventure cycling route tour through Death Valley in Nevada and California, and we've stayed in touch since then. And one of the first episodes was an interview with one of our compadres on that, Colleen Ponzini. And I appreciate the fact that you took the time to listen to that podcast. And, you know, just speaking with you a month or so ago, I knew that you would be an excellent guest on the podcast, because what we're trying to do here is inspire people to not just ride a bike, but let your bike take you places that you've never been before. Ride a bike to go someplace, travel by bike. And you have certainly done that. So before we go into your personal adventures, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive into one of your favorite adventures.
That sounds great. So I am 65 years old. I am retired for a few years. I was an emergency room nurse. I am happily married with 2 wonderful children, 3 wonderful grandchildren. I guess I made a promise to myself I wasn't going to sound like an old fart, but I've been bike riding since I was a little kid, because when we were kids, that was the only way you got places, whether it was even riding to school with a key around my neck, or riding to the park, or riding to the beach. Then the kids came, didn't do much bike riding. My father got into some touring, which I watched from afar. We went on a couple little rides together. And then when I hit about 50 and the kids, I didn't have little league games to go to anymore and all of that, I got more into it. And now I am hooked. It is my favorite thing to do in the world. Growing up, I was an athlete wannabe. And what that means, I wanted to be on the baseball team. Actually, when I was a young person, when someone asked me what I wanted to do, my plans was to be a second baseman for the New York Yankees. But it didn't take long to realize I wasn't born with that talent. And then the beauty of bike riding is, yes, I didn't make the football team, I didn't make the basketball team, I didn't make the baseball team, but I could ride a bike, and I could do that when I wanted. And that's one of the reasons why I got hooked on it, and that's why I still do that to this day.
You have a bike, and something inspires you to ride this bike more than just around the neighborhood. What was the genesis of that?
Well, I found out that when you travel by a bike, you talked about exploring new areas. If you can ride your bike in an area that you've been by car many, many times, but I have a little saying, you travel the world by a car, you see the world by a bike. You see things differently when you're going by yourself, and you can stop when you want to stop. And it's just a way. I think I mentioned I was a nurse in an emergency department. I loved that job, but it was a very, very, very high stress job. Due to the work, due to what I saw, the good I saw, the terrible things in my life I saw. And bike riding for me was almost like a relaxing therapy. You just go out and do your thing. That's where I do my thinking. Sometimes I'll go on a long trip, and when I come home, the first thing my wife says, okay, where are we going now? Or what are we going to do now? Because that's where I come up with my ideas of things. So I just found it. And then it becomes very contagious. You just, where can I go next? When can I go next? And it's just, as I said, it is, to my mind, it's just such a great way to get exercise. But I mean, nothing against the people who like to run, or the people who like to do that. I just do it for the mental exercise and the physical exercise.
What was the impetus for you to take your first bike trip? What did you have, and how did you decide where you were going to go?
So that's a good question. So I did do one trip with my father when I was very, very young. So, and then he was doing it. So I had it in the back of my mind. And when I turned 50, I said, okay, I need to do something special for myself. So I always wanted to go on a trip. I had never really done an organized trip or a trip more than, one day. And I had always wanted to go to Israel. So I found a touring group, Freewheel Adventures, and I booked a organized trip basically from in Israel. We went all the way from Jerusalem to Eilat. It was a great adventure. And that was, I've gone on all kinds of trips. That was the kind of trip where, they pamper you a little bit. You stay in hotels, there's food, you ride your bike, you really don't have to carry anything. And it was great. It really was. I became very friendly with actually the tour guide, and I'm still friends with him today. So then I came home and said, I need to do more, but I was still working. Then the next trip I did was completely by myself, and I had this great idea to go from Los Angeles to San Francisco, which I did, but I was on a very tight schedule. And again, at the beginning, all bike people, when they travel, when they first start, bring way too much gear, plan way too much. But it's, you got to do the learning curve. So I did that trip. And then from there, I've just been expanding. I've done 3 trips with adventure cycling. One where the C&O Canal, where they basically pack everything for you and bring you food. I've done one which is completely unsupported with no van. That was the Key West down the Keys trip. And then I did the one that we did together, and where you had a van, but you still had to do your cooking. I've done all 3. I've also done many. I think I did a count. I've done about 18, 19 trips. I've done a lot of trips where we call credit card trips, which is, you go, but at the end of the day, you're staying in a hotel.
Yes.
I've also done some solo camping, and I've been trying to get a little more into that now, because in the back of my brain, if I can work it before I'm way too old, I do want to do the bucket list item is to go cross country. So we will see if that happens. But so as I said, all of them have their pluses and minuses, and I've enjoyed all of them for different reasons. So
people who listen to this podcast are trying to pick up on a couple of things. One is, how adventurous should I be? How should I start out? And should I go with some friends like Colleen Ponzini, or should I take a tour, an organized tour where there's lots of people and lots of support? What do you think?
Well, I think everybody's different. There are tours that you can go on that are organized, that are, your 5-star tour. You ride your 30 miles. And that, for those people, that's wonderful. That's more than I want. Colleen mentioned it on your other podcast, and I agree completely. And I know adventure cycling now is trying to push this. Just get on your bike, go 30 miles from your house, camp someplace, or maybe even stay in a hotel and just come back, but start slow. Because as I said, you can watch, when I started, there weren't all these millions of YouTube videos to educate you. There also wasn't all these GPS and whatever, but you can watch all the YouTubes you want. It's a learning process. So, and each time I do a trip, I learn something new that I will do differently. I'm trying so hard, and it's very hard for me to do it, not to pack so much stuff. It's okay when you're supposed to be traveling alone. It's okay if you smell. Sometimes it's easier to get a seat in a restaurant if you smell. And, you don't have to change a clean shirt every day. You don't always have to have everything. You don't have to plan somewhere. My first trip to San Francisco, I planned so much that I had all my hotels booked before I went, which is a big mistake, because some days your plan is to go 60 miles. You've got an unbelievable wind at your back, and you go 90. And on the other hand, some days you plan on going 60 miles, your legs feel lousy, the weather is lousy, and you want to go 30. I had, the first night I left on that trip, my plan was to do about 65 miles, and I'm taking the leisurely course. And also, I must admit, I knew I could do 70 miles a day, but that was at home, but not a heavy bike, not climbing hills. It turned out the first night I got to the hotel that I had a reservation, I didn't pull in until 10:30 at night. Why? Because it took a lot longer than I expected. So, it's just a matter of starting slow and working your way up, and what your comfort level is. If you're comfortable riding in the pouring rain with the right raining gear, that's good for you. If it's not, that's fine. That is, you probably are getting the vibe that I do most of my trips solo. And I know Colleen does a lot with groups, and God bless her. One of the reasons I like going solo is because I can stop when I want to stop, go when I want to go, sit here under the tree for an hour if I want to. If the weather is lousy, but I want to push through, it's my concern only. And, again, it's what I feel comfortable doing.
I really appreciate when you were talking about trying to economize on how much stuff you carry in a self-contained kind of bike trip. I recently did just an overnight, a Saturday, Sunday overnight with a group of people in Los Angeles. We rode down to Encinitas in San Diego County. We looked like we were headed to Baja, Mexico. We all had all our bags on the back. We had bags on the front. Some had backpacks. Some had handlebar packs. And when we got to camp, everybody said the same thing. I didn't need all this stuff, but I was afraid not to bring it.
Well, and it also depends where you're going. We are in the day and age, if you're traveling even if it's a little desolate, but you have cell phones and stores, you can always purchase stuff. Versus if you're doing, it's funny because I know Colleen talked about that she went from Phoenix to San Diego. I've done that same trip. And there isn't one day where it's like 85 miles through the desert with nothing around. Well, that kind of leg, you have to plan with more gear than you do if you're traveling someplace else. But we are all guilty. The only places I've learned over time that I don't cut corners is you cannot allow yourself to get wet and cold. So I will cut corners. Maybe I'm wearing a shirt that doesn't smell that good, but I always make sure I have enough rain gear to keep myself dry, and if it's cold, enough gear to keep myself warm. Because on that first trip to San Francisco, I got in a day when it was raining and windy. The wind was so strong in my face, you cruise downhill at 5 miles an hour. But I actually had to stop the trip early and get some help because I think I was getting hypothermic because I got cold and wet. And that is a dangerous thing. But other stuff you need to bring the basic tools to fix your bike, a tube, etc. But in this day and age, we have cell phones. We can call for help if we really need to. I always try to have a backup plan when I'm riding. I used to fly airplanes, and one of the things we learned when we were flying single-engine airplanes is always know where you're going to put the plane down if the engine stops. I always like to try to, when I'm planning a trip, what will I do if the bicycle just becomes unrideable anymore? Am I close enough that I can call an Uber? Am I close enough that I can walk to get to a train station? But I've learned, and I learned on the trip that we went, when I had a little bit of a problem, you have a bicycle that's loaded, even on a desolate road. If you wave your hand, someone's going to come by and give you a little pull up. How can I help you? What can I do? People are very helpful. So, again, it's just being prepared, I guess. But
let me ask you, what bike did you start with, and what's been the progression of that?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because it's when I get asked about getting into bike riding, I'm asked that a lot. And I am a strong believer that 50-60% of the people who ride bike are riding the wrong bike for them. They're riding the bike that either they saw on and now people are even buying bikes, on the internet and getting delivered to their house. I'm a big advocate. I've been going to the same bike store for over 30 years, Carl Hart here on Long Island. And, you have to get the bike that's best for you and for what you're doing. I don't need a bike with little tiny skinny tires unless I like getting flats. I need a touring bike. I also do not like to. Again, I'm not a racer. I don't like to drop handlebars. I like to be more elevated up. It's good for my back. It's good. Sure, I understand drag and everything, but my speed is 11 miles an hour. A little bit of drag is not changing me from 11.2. Like if I was bent over with handlebars, I'd be going 18 miles an hour. It's not going to make a difference. It's all about comfort and seeing everything. So I started out with a hybrid, a Trek hybrid, That's actually what I did my first trips with. And I was using that. And then as I was getting more serious and whatever, I decided to go and I got a Surly long haul trucker. There are many, many touring bikes out there, and there are many things I'm interested. One of doing bike research is not one of the things I'm interested in. I'm not. You could talk to people, and they talk about, like, if you ask me now in this podcast, so what derailleur are you using in the back? I'm going to say, well, the one that my bike store put on because they said it was good for it. Because I don't want to know that stuff. So I went with the Surly long haul trucker because I knew it was a proven commodity. It had, good reputation, etc. But then I worked with my bike store because the Surly long haul trucker had drop bars. I didn't want those. Not only did I want straight bars, I wanted bars that were even more elevated. And they helped me put an extender in. They then, because of that, they had to get a different gear set, whatever. They worked with me, and my bike is specific for me, not only for the size, but what I need. So what I recommend to anybody is, I said, you've got to go to a good bike store. You've got to get fitted. Because, I'm sure there is a high percentage of people who got into bike riding and got out and said, well, it's not for me. My butt hurt, my back hurt, my neck hurt, etc. And if they were riding the proper bike for them, that probably wouldn't be the case. Yeah. So since 2015, I'm riding the same bicycle, the Surly long haul trucker. Love it. It's, made of steel. I'm not going to win any contest for lightweight. I don't care. My opinion, I know that everybody talks about composites, but I think there's some danger with composites because if they get little cracks here and there, you might not know it until you're going down a hill. And it's comfortable and it holds what I want to do. And I've never had any problem with it. Love it.
I think you told me that you rode across New York and into Canada. Do I have that right? Tell me about that.
I had Amtrak start me. I started from Vermont.
Okay.
And again, I have, at that time I was working, and when you're working, you are on a specific schedule. Now I'm a little more loose on time, but I went from Vermont to Canada.
Tell me about the route. You were riding your trucker, or you were riding something else?
Nope. So this, again, I had thoughts. I'm for people who are maybe not aware, and this is also a lot of work done by Adventure Cycling. Amtrak, which used to be very bike unfriendly, is becoming very bike friendly now, which works out perfect because for anybody who's gone on a trip that has to box up a bike to take it someplace, you do what you got to do, but it's a pain in the neck job. It's a pain in the neck schlepping your bike to the airport, or you can use one of these services to transfer. But Amtrak now is expanding their bike service. So as I was planning trips and going places, I wanted to see how I could incorporate that. I also had, I like to go places different. One of Adventure, again, I know you've talked about Adventure Cycling in the past, and I've been a member forever. They have multiple different routes. And one of my goals is try to at least, even if it's only 10 miles, to see how many of those routes I can touch on bike traveling. And I'm getting there, but whatever. So the Amtrak from here takes you to northern Vermont. In a town called St. Albans. That's the end. Okay. So I had this great thought that working with my work schedule, etc., I would take the train to St. Albans. I would ride from there to Quebec, ride around Quebec, and then again, because of time constraints, I would take the Canada train from Quebec to Montreal, and then I'd meander beyond Montreal back down to St. Albans. And that was the plan. And it was great. I had it planned for the first week of April. And then my lovely wife says to me, that might be a little too early in the year for that trip. Because, April. I said, April's fine. Of course, I don't live in Canada. So I got on the train that morning around here to head up to St. Albans. And as we kind of pulled up into Vermont, I'm looking outside and I go, oh, it's snowing a little bit. And it's snowing and it's snowing. And then we're passing some. So by the time we got to St. Albans, it was kind of a blizzard. But my hotel was close by. And, it worked out okay. Again, I'm not doing this to make people who are interested in bike riding say, "Gee, this is why I don't want to ride a bike."
Right.
I have never been on a trip that went exactly to plan. But that, in my mind, is the beauty of it, is because you have to overcome. And when especially at our age, and I'm older than you, I think, maybe not, there is no better feeling when you are done with a 2-week trip and you accomplished and you had some things to get through, that you can look at the mirror and say, "Look what I just did." And there's a lot of people who can't do that. There's not a better feeling in the world. So anyway, I got up to Vermont, rode up to Quebec. It was freezing cold. The roads had been cleared. I had planned on doing some bike paths. Those weren't cleared. And then as I got close to Quebec, it snowed again. It was coming down pretty heavy. But again, that's the beauty of traveling by yourself. It's so funny. I was a few miles from my final destination, and it was snowing pretty hard. You had to clean the snow out of the gears, etc. And a guy pulls over with a pickup truck, because people are so helpful. And he pulls over. He says, "Where are you going?" I said, I know it's not that far, but would you like a lift? And I said to him, "I know this is going to sound stupid, but I made it this far. I want to finish." And he looked at me with a straight face and goes, "I understand completely. I'm a bike rider." So I got to Montreal. I got to Quebec and made it okay. And it's funny, most hotels don't mind you bringing their bikes into the room. Every once in a while, you get a pain in the neck. But this bike was covered with so much snow and ice and frozen. So I kept the bike on, like, in the parking lot to check in. I didn't let them know I had a bike with me. And then I got my room, and then I snuck my bike through the back door up into the room. And first thing I did is put the whole bike in the bathtub, so when it thawed out, it wouldn't leave a mess. Then I took the train to Montreal, and the plan was there's about 3 bridges that you can ride out of Montreal to get over the river. None of those bridges were opening up for another 3 weeks because they were still closed for the winter. So ended up having to take a subway out of Montreal and made it back. Anyway, it was a great adventure, and my wife was right. It was a little bit too early, but it is what happens. As I said, you never go on a trip, and you never goes according to plan, and that is I think the fun of it. But again, if that's not your thing, then you get an organized trip that has a van, which we did when we were on our Death Valley trip. There was a day that the wind was like 60 miles an hour in our face, and they helped us a little bit. So I mean, there's nothing wrong with that too.
Nothing wrong with that. I think you hit on something that I'm glad you did, because I call it that oh shit moment when you're on a bike trip and you realize that you're in a situation that you hadn't counted on. Yours was snow. Mine was switchbacks in the Santa Barbara mountains, where I was thinking, I haven't seen a car in over a couple of hours. This would be a terrible place to break down. I had to hike a bike several times because of the steep grades.
Mm-hmm.
The sun is beginning to cut, and it's like, you can't go backwards. You can only go forward. And when I finally made the summit of that and was coasting down into Goleta, California, where I was going to spend the night, I was beyond elated. It was one of the greatest feelings I've ever had to overcome that, because the self-doubt really creeps in when you're in those situations. And like you said, we don't want to discourage anybody from taking up bike travel. There are many different ways that you could do that. But the real adventure is, if you're out there on your own or you're with a couple of other people, you can't anticipate every variable. And the main ones are hills, headwinds, and heat, maybe. And that either one or all 3 of those may hit you at the same time.
Yeah, if it was easy, everybody would do it, right? So, I just recently rode up to Providence, and I purposely took a very mountainous, in the hilly, through the back road way, because I wanted to experience that, and I made it. It was a lot of climbing, but it was also a very hot, humid day, and I'm gotten better. I ran out of water, and it was getting a little dangerous, so I found a nice house that had a hose in front. I walked up, I knocked on the door, nobody was there. I talked to the house. I said, house, I'm sure they won't, unless they're a real kook that has, 40 machine guns, I'm sure they're not going to mind if I take a little water out of their garden hose. And I did, and I was able to get the next 15 miles into where I was able to get water. So, yeah, it's, there is, no, I repeat, and I don't, maybe, and I often wonder if it was because as a kid, again, I wanted to be an athlete and I couldn't be an athlete. There is no better feeling that when you really conquer something that was difficult and it's all done at the end of the day, it's a nice feeling to be able to do that, to pull up to the driveway after a long day, or like sometimes I come back. Well, I remember one trip was a real difficult trip, and I took the ferry back to Long Island, and then there was my wife at the other end with the car waiting for me to take us, left at home with a big smile. There's nothing better than that. So nothing better than that at all. So
end of the ride. Very true. Okay. So Vermont to Canada and back. What else have you done?
Okay, so let's. I'll give you the bigger ones. So I told you I did the Phoenix to San Diego ride. I love the ocean, so I've done a couple. I did the Outer Banks of North Carolina. So if people don't know, if they want to leave their car places, the best safe place, and usually it's not too expensive to park your car, is at an airport. So like I wanted to do I did all the Outer Banks of North Carolina. I drove down to Virginia Beach, pulled into the airport and parked the car there for 6 days. I try to get my wife doesn't ride, but I try to get her involved in our trips sometimes because we do enjoy adventures. So like an adventure, I lived on Long Island. I live on Long Island. I rode to Boston. Then she took the train. We spent a few days in Boston, took the ferry across to Provincetown, Cape Cod. Then she went home and I rode down the Cape. But I guess my longest trips were, as I said, the one couple in California. I've done in Florida. I did one the whole Jersey Shore. I've ridden to Washington, D.C. several times. I did a trip to Maine a couple of times. All my limit has always been about 10. Well, when I was working, it was like an 8-day limit. Now I'm up to a 2-week, which is good because it used to be because I had this limit, I would end up doing 80-mile days, which are doable, but it really stinks when you're riding and you say, boy, I didn't know there was this little museum here. I'd like to stop, but I can't because it's in the schedule. Right. So I tried to do that. But now 2 weeks are kind of my limit. I just rode my bicycle from Buffalo. So you want to talk about plans changing. So I just rode my bicycle from Buffalo to Detroit, but that was not the plan. I took the train to Buffalo, and then I was going to ride the north part of Lake Erie, about 2/3 of the way west, and then head down. There was a ferry to Pelee Island and camp there. And then I was going to head back and end in Cleveland at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And when I was on the train going up to Buffalo, I got a call from the ferry, and their ferry was out of service, and it was going to be gone out of service for a couple months, so I no longer could go that way. So on the train for the next 6 hours, I planned a whole new vacation, and I decided to ride all the way to Detroit and then come home from Detroit. And it worked out great because I ended up going to the Motown Museum in Detroit. And for anybody who's ever in Detroit, it's great. So, again, plans change as you go along. So,
yeah, I agree. Stop and check out things on the way because you're on a bike. You're not in a hurry, and you have the opportunity to spend a little bit of time. That's a great story about using the train.
I learned this on my first trip, and I learned this. And people say, I always tell them, do you enjoy bike riding? Oh, I love it. It's the best. I said, then why are you rushing to finish? What's the purpose of going fast? But I learned this story the hard way. I never forget. It was my first trip in Israel, and it was the end of a really tough day. But the last part of the day was going to be like a 5-mile, unbelievable downhill into where we were staying that night. So everybody, me included, and the group was only about 5 people. We're cruising down that hill like 30 miles an hour, 35. I kind of have a limit because I think being an emergency nurse, I know what's the difference between crashing at 20 miles an hour and 40
miles. Yes, you
do. There's an old rule. If you double the speed, you quadruple the force. So anyway, got to the bottom, and I know the tour guide wasn't so happy that everybody went so fast because, you know, it's dangerous. And I never forget, he said this to me. I go, look, that was great. We went downhill. We're going fifth speed. Blah, blah. He goes, oh, yeah, I know. When you ran around that corner, did you see that old Roman fort on the right side? It's right on the corner. I go, no. Well, when you went down that other corner, did you see that, you know, this? And it was like, he listed like 5 things I didn't see. And he said, well, if you were going a little slower, you might have enjoyed some of the scenery. So, and on our trip in Death Valley, there was that one long downhill. I kept it going slow because you just never know. So, but you like to see things. So
I pumped my brakes on that downhill as well. I'll never forget it. But
yeah,
and there was one member of the group passed me going like I was standing still.
Yeah, I mean, and listen. One thing about bike riding, to each his own, and you take your risks. You're right. There were a couple of people said, "I think I hit 49 on my bike." Yeah, and that's great, and whatever. But you don't see as much, and it doesn't. You can lose control anyway. So I and it's funny because and you have the same bike as me. My bike, the maximum speed you can pedal is like 21 miles an hour.
Yeah,
you cannot pedal faster, and people will say to you, oh my God, well, what happens if you want to pedal 30? I say, listen, if I'm on a touring bike loaded with bags, I shouldn't be going faster than 21 miles an hour. Slow. I like to consider myself the tortoise. Slow and steady. I will always get to the finish. I will always be the first one to leave in the morning and the last one to get there in the evening, because I want to enjoy the scenery, and I don't want to, And you talked about walking. Maybe it's because at our age we're not embarrassed. I have no embarrassment of walking up a hill.
Nope.
And if I have a long day ahead of me, and I know the grade that I have troubles with, but if I'm killing myself to ride up a hill at 4 miles an hour, and I can walk it at 2.6 miles an hour, you don't have to be a brain surgeon to know it makes no sense to kill you and use all that strength to go at 4 miles an hour when you can walk it at 2.6. And I've been on hills where I've walked for an hour.
Yeah,
but that's okay. Then I had better legs later in the day, and it's, as I said, I don't, it's not like a macho thing that I have to admit that I walked the bike up a hill. Hills that were doable at 10 in the morning are not always doable at 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
They definitely are. They most certainly are not. I can attest to that.
Yep.
What trips do you have planned in the future, Larry?
Well, again, I think I told you I try to keep my wife involved in our trip. So in the spring, we are going to take a Viking cruise around Holland, and we're going to Amsterdam. We're going to Amsterdam, a tulip cruise, and that's about a 10-day cruise. So what we're going to do is I'm going to fly to London about 10 days before that, and then I will take a nice bike trip from London across the English Channel to France. I'm a big World War II buff, and there's a lot of museums there, and I will get to Amsterdam probably a day or two before she flies out. Then I'll somehow find a way to ship my bike back, and then we'll do that. So that's my next big trip is planned, even though I haven't mentioned this to my wife yet, so I guess if she listens to this, she'll know. I do want to do the Erie Canal Trail from Buffalo to Albany, and my son lives close to there. So I'm looking at the calendar to see if maybe in September and October I can, before it gets too cold, if I can squeeze a weekend. But I have a feeling that's not going to happen. But that's my thing. I know you just did Ragbroad, right? How was that?
I just finished. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. It was hot. The routes were long. It was over 70 miles a day. You had to get up and get on the bike and get out of town because you had to get to the next overnight town. But it was a very hilly route, and it kind of ran in a jagged southeastern direction, and the wind in the summer in Iowa comes out of the southeast. So we were riding into a headwind most of the time. I went through bottles and bottles and bottles of water. Hydration was no problem. I took advantage of all the pop-ups along the way. They had no limit on the number of people that could participate this year. It was the 50th anniversary. So there were, I'm exaggerating, but it seemed like there were 1 million cyclists on the road with you every day. And the line of bikes just stretched for miles and miles. It was quite an impressive sight. But I finished it. I survived it. I'm glad I did it. I think I'm done with RAGBRAI. That was my second one. But I encourage anybody who hasn't done it. It's really something that you should do. There's no event like it in the world.
Yeah, I from what I was following from afar, they did say it was very, very crowded, and it's just something. It's on my bucket list of doing things. But you brought up there is, so those were 70, 80-mile days. So I'm sure, because I know like almost every town in RAGBRAI has events, and I'm sure there were some events that you really thought would have been cool to stop at, but you couldn't because I still got 35 miles to go, and so that's why, as I said. And again, I know when I work and when people work, they're on a tight schedule if they have family commitments. But the best way to travel is if you have a ballpark on your time limit, but that you can change a little bit as the days go by. But
I want to share a story with you about RAGBRAI. I believe it was the second day. We were going from Storm Lake to Carroll, Iowa. 80 miles. And I'm pumping up a hill and I see a guy off to the side. I'm passing him basically. And I noticed that he's wearing a jersey that says Delaware Blue Hen Bike Club on the back. And I'm thinking, there was a guy on the Death Valley tour with us that had a jersey just like that, the Delaware Blue Hen Bike Club. And as I got a little closer, it was the guy that was on our tour with us. It was Glenn. Do you remember Glenn?
I do. We are a very community, because I had the same thing. One of the 5 guys who went on my Israel tour, when I did the C&O Canal tour, he was on the same tour. We were at the it is a small world, and it's funny because there's a lot of people who do this stuff, but it's still in the big population. It's a small world. So it is right. It is funny how that works. You do bump into people, and then also and I don't know if we've discussed this. People, if you put bike bags on your bike, it is amazing. Even on my last trip to Canada, where I already had set up my tent in the campsite, I was driving because I had time, so I was going to an airspace museum that was in the town, and some guy was riding past. He goes, "Oh, hello." And we were chatting. I was telling him, "Oh, we're having a big party at my house today. If we weren't, I would have been more than happy to let you set up your tent in my backyard." But that happens all the time. People, do you need anything? I can't tell you how many times when I did, I forgot which trip it was. They all run together. I went to this was right after COVID, so I wasn't comfortable eating inside. So it was one of these kind of bars that had outside tables, and I'm sitting there having my dinner and a beer. And this couple starts to talk to me next door. Says, "We think we saw you on the road back about 20 miles. So of course, as you know, and I know, just ask any bike rider to talk about bike riding. And, this podcast should go 10 hours because we just love to talk about it. So we were chatting, and it was all said and done. I asked the server for my bill. He goes, "Oh, don't worry about it. They took care of it." It's like, they paid for my dinner because people are, they're so, in the news, we always hear about the bad people, but most people are so friendly. So it was great. So that first trip I did to San Francisco, I was on a time schedule, and since I was running way behind, I ended up having to get assistance. And actually, I just redid that trip a couple of years ago, and I called it the Redemption Tour, because the first time I had to get an assist for about 50 miles in a truck because I was running behind schedule. And I never forget, I found this guy. He had like a pickup truck, and I said, "Is there any chance you could, I'm way behind, and I got this long climb into Big Sur, and then whatever." I said, "Could you just take me up the hill, the 50 miles, so I could get back on schedule?" And he really didn't want to. And I kind of said to him, I said, "Listen, I'll pay you. I'm desperate." So I offered, I don't know, let's just say I offered him $150. We ended up chatting so much on the way up that when we got to the top, he says to me, "This was really very enjoyable. I'm not going to take your money." And I said to him, "Well, let me tell you, it's bad karma not to give you the money. So I'm giving you the money anyway. And if you don't want it, donate it to the charity of your choice. But, he was willing to help. And I've had that all the time. People, do you need anything? It's funny when you pull over the side of the road just to answer a text, people will pull over all the time. You okay? You okay? Is everything all right? So, yeah, no, but people are there. And you see the stories on other people. Come stay in my house, come stay in my backyard. I know a lot of people use this warm showers.
Warm showers.
I have not used it yet, and I know Colleen, who you talked to and who we rode together, she's great at just meeting up with strangers and going from. I have to still get that talent, and I just sometimes I wonder at the end of the day if I want to just. So I haven't used them yet, but it is for those people who travel. It's a great way, and it's also a great way to meet people. Having people stay with you also. So, all right,
keep
Brian.
going and ride safely. And yes, I think you've done a lot to encourage people, and I can't wait to get this posted so that we can get more people to consider, like you say, ride for a few miles, ride for many miles, but your bike can take you many, many places. Give it a chance.
Yep, it is the best. And as I said, there are plenty of places. If you're afraid of cars, there are ways to work around that. It's if you want to, there's ways to work around it. So.
Yes, there are.
All
Larry,
right.
thanks again.
All right, take care. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.